The first thing I noticed when I drove down the gravel path to my little cabin in Pine Hollow was the smell, wet pine needles, earthy soil, and something faintly metallic that hinted at winter frost melting on the roof. I'd been dreaming of this cabin for years, saving every dollar, working overtime, and enduring the endless city noise, and now here I was, about to unlock the front door to the peace I'd imagined. Little did I know that peace had a very short expiration date. I pulled up, turned off the engine, and froze. There she was, standing on my porch, a woman in a bright pink cardigan that clashed violently with the muted greens and browns of the forest, clipboard in hand, glaring at me like I had personally insulted her entire neighborhood association. She had that classic HOA Karen aura, perfectly manicured nails, sunglasses reflecting my car like a pair of judgmental eyes, and a voice that could cut through a winter storm. "Excuse me," she barked before I could even breathe. "You know you're not allowed to have that cabin here. This isn't just your property. It's part of the community, and the HOA has rules." I blinked, confused. Rules? My cabin had been grandfathered in for decades. I had all the legal paperwork, permits, and every scrap of evidence that said I was in the clear. I own this property," I said carefully. "This is my cabin." "You can't." "I can," she interrupted, her voice rising. "And I will. You think you can just move in and ignore the rules? I'm calling the cops." That's when my stomach dropped. Not because she could physically take the cabin. She couldn't, but because I realized I was about to be dragged into a war I didn't even know existed. And in Pine Hollow, everyone knew HOA battles weren't friendly debates. They were feuds that lasted years, draining bank accounts and sanity alike. And that was when I heard it, the faint hum of a siren in the distance. The siren wasn't real. Not yet. But the way Karen's eyes sparkled with triumph made it feel like the law itself was marching toward me. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. I wasn't about to let some self-appointed neighborhood dictator intimidate me into leaving my dream cabin. I said slowly, keeping my voice steady. "I have all the paperwork. My property is legal. My cabin has been here since 1982, and the HOA has never once objected. Until now." Her expression twisted, like I had just personally insulted her family tree. "Oh, I know all about that. Doesn't matter. Rules evolve, and the community deserves better than random outsiders buying in and doing whatever they please." I looked past her, at the cabin I'd meticulously renovated, the chip blue shutters I'd restored, the tiny stone path I had laid, the smoke curling lazily from a chimney. This wasn't just a house. This was my sanctuary, and she was trying to erase it. "I'm not doing anything illegal," I said, firm now. "You can't just show up and—" "Watch me," she snapped. Before I could react, she pulled out her phone and pressed buttons furiously. I didn't hear the words she was saying, but I knew she was telling someone I was in violation of something. I had no idea what exactly. The last thing I expected was my first night here turning into a battle with a woman who thought she owned the entire forest. Then I noticed movement from the next cabin over. An elderly man, leaning on his cane, peered out from behind a tree. He squinted at Karen, then at me. "Oh, it's her," he muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "That Karen. Lord help you." "Who?" I asked, glancing at him. "You'll see," he said cryptically, retreating back inside. Karen, oblivious to him, kept gesturing wildly toward my cabin. "You need to leave, now, or I'll have the sheriff remove you." That's when the first tension crack appeared. I realized she had no legal standing, yet the mere threat of calling law enforcement had me momentarily frozen. But I refused to give her the satisfaction. "I'm staying. You can call whoever you want. The law's on my side," I said, trying to sound braver than I felt. Her lip curled, and she spun on her heel like a general withdrawing to strategize. "Oh, you'll regret this," she hissed before marching off the porch. I watched her stump down the path, muttering to herself. I had no idea what kind of vendetta I'd just stepped into, but I knew this wasn't over. I went inside and locked the door. The cabin felt cozy and warm, but my nerves were frayed. I poured myself a cup of tea, trying to ignore the echo of Karen's shrill voice. I couldn't help but notice the little quirks in the cabin now, a crooked painting I'd hung, the stack of firewood I'd spent hours arranging, the faint smell of cedar from the beams. This place was mine. And somehow, I had a feeling Karen was about to make my life miserable for claiming it. As dusk fell, shadows stretched long across the forest floor. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying a faint warning. Somewhere out there, Karen was plotting. And somehow, I had a front row seat to whatever her next move was. I decided to do what anyone would do in my situation. I grabbed my laptop and started documenting everything. Photos of the cabin, notes about her visit, timestamps. If this escalated, I wanted proof. This wasn't paranoia. This was strategy. By the time night fully settled, the forest was dark and quiet, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A light flickered in the cabin next door, and I thought I saw shadows moving. Neighbors I hadn't met before peered cautiously out of windows, whispering to one another. One thing became clear. Karen didn't operate alone. She had allies, informants, or maybe just a way of making everyone fear her wrath. I closed the curtains and leaned back in my chair, staring at the flickering fire in the hearth. This was supposed to be my escape from chaos. Instead, chaos had found me, and it had a name. Karen. Little did I know, this was only the beginning. The next morning, she would return with even more audacity, and I would have to make a choice, back down or fight for every inch of my dream. But one thing was certain, I wasn't going anywhere, not without a battle. Morning came like a reluctant witness. Sunlight seeped through the cabin's curtains, painting golden streaks across the wooden floors, but instead of feeling warm, it felt like an alarm. I didn't have to look outside to know. Karen was back. Sure enough, within minutes, there was a faint pounding on my door. Slow, deliberate. I opened it just enough to see her framed in the doorway, clipboard clutched like a weapon. Her pink cardigan was brighter than ever, almost fluorescent in the morning sun, and her hair had a perfect curl that defied gravity. "Good morning," she chirped, though it sounded more like a warning. "I trust you had time to reconsider your situation here." I crossed my arms. "Nope, I'm staying. As I said yesterday, everything's legal. Now, if you don't mind, I'd like some peace." Her lips tightened. Peace? There can be no peace when someone flagrantly disregards community rules. And you, my friend, are flagrantly disregarding the community. Then she started rattling off a list. I barely had time to catch my breath before she launched into HOA jargon that sounded like it came straight out of an obscure legal textbook. Unauthorized structures, non-compliant landscaping, deviation from community aesthetic guidelines, not to mention the potential safety hazards of your cabin's chimney. You are in violation of Articles 12, 19, and 23. I tried not to laugh. Article 23? What was this, a dystopian HOA novel? I said, my voice steady but my jaw tight. This cabin has been here for 40 years. You can cite all the articles you want, but it doesn't change the fact that I own this property. Everything you just listed has been inspected and approved. Karen's eyes narrowed, her nostril flaring. Approval? Approval can be reconsidered. I wanted to roll my eyes, but something told me to be careful. She wasn't just a cranky neighbor. She was organized, and I had a feeling she had a network. Sure enough, as if on cue, 2 other neighbors appeared on their porches across the street. One of them waved at Karen, nodding conspiratorially. My stomach sank. This was turning into a full-blown siege. Karen took a step closer. "You know, I really don't want to escalate this, but if you insist on ignoring the rules, I will involve law enforcement again. And this time, I'll make sure every infraction is documented. Every single one." I felt my pulse spike. It was true. Once she had law enforcement on her side, even with flimsy claims, things could get messy. But I refused to panic. I straightened my shoulders and met her gaze. "Go ahead. Call them. I've got all my permits and documentation right here. You can't bully me out of my home." Her expression flickered. For a moment, I thought I saw hesitation. Then she smiled, sharp, predatory. "You think it's bullying? I think it's maintaining order. But don't worry, you'll see my definition of order soon enough." And with that, she turned and stormed back to her car, muttering into her phone. I could hear the faint click of her heels on the gravel as she disappeared down the path. I exhaled, trying to calm my racing thoughts. But I didn't have time. A knock came at my window. I jumped and saw the elderly neighbor from yesterday, Mr. Jennings, standing there with his cane tapping the ground impatiently. "Mind if I come in?" he asked. I hesitated, but the look in his eyes told me he was an ally. "Sure," I said, unlocking the door. Once inside, he sat heavily in the chair opposite the fireplace. "You're in deeper than you realize," he said, shaking his head. "Karen doesn't just enforce rules. She creates problems. She's the kind of HOA president who sees a tree branch out of place and writes you a 10-page report about it." "I gathered that," I said, trying to keep my tone calm. "But what can I do? I can't just leave my cabin." He leaned in, lowering his voice. "You're not going to leave, are you?" "No," I said firmly. He nodded, a small smile forming. "Good. Then you're going to need allies. Karen's strength isn't her position. It's a fear she spreads. But fear dies when people stand together. There are others around here who've had run-ins with her. Some have been driven crazy. Some have lost property. You don't want to be next." My mind raced. "So, what do I do?" "Document everything," he said. "Photos, notes, dates, times. Every interaction. And be ready. She will escalate." I nodded. He rose slowly, cane in hand. "I'll check on you tomorrow. Keep your head. And remember, don't engage more than you need to. Karen thrives on reactions." After he left, the cabin felt eerily quiet. I sat back down and reviewed my notes from yesterday. I realized Karen's attack wasn't personal. It was systematic. She had rules memorized, articles cited, allies watching, and she had no intention of stopping. By late afternoon, my instincts proved right. I was working in the small kitchen when a truck pulled up outside. Loud, obnoxious. Karen stepped out, flanked by two younger neighbors I hadn't seen before. She waved at me like a victorious general surveying her enemy. "Evening," she called. "I brought friends. Thought we could discuss your cabin situation." I clenched my fist but smiled tightly. "I'm busy, but thanks for the offer." "Oh, don't worry," she said, striding up the steps. "We'll be brief." The truck's engine idled in the gravel as Karen's team began photographing the exterior of my cabin, scribbling notes on clipboards, and pointing at every little detail. Cracked paint, uneven shutters, leaves on the porch. I could practically hear my blood boiling, but I forced myself to stay calm. One of them finally called out, "Are you homeowner?" "Yes," I said, stepping outside and holding my ground. "Did you know your cabin violates Section 12.4 of the HOA Compliance Code?" Karen demanded. I blinked. "You mean the code that was written after my cabin was built?" She ignored me and continued documenting, her smile razor-sharp. It was clear they weren't here to talk. They were here to intimidate. Finally, I had enough. "You're harassing me," I said firmly. "I own this property. You cannot trespass on my land." Karen laughed, a cold, triumphant sound. "Trespass? Please. I am protecting the community. The law is on my side. If you refuse to cooperate, we'll see what the sheriff says." And with that, she turned on her heel, marched down the driveway, and disappeared with her entourage, leaving me standing in the fading sunlight, exhausted and enraged. I went inside, locking the doors and windows. I realized something important. Karen wasn't just a problem. She was a storm, and I had no choice but to prepare. This wasn't going to be resolved with polite conversation. If I wanted to keep my cabin, I had to fight. And deep down, I knew the next move would be even worse. The next morning, I woke to a silence that felt heavier than usual. It wasn't peaceful. It was loaded, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. My phone buzzed on the kitchen counter, a single text from an unknown number. "HOA notice delivered. Comply immediately or face legal action. Karen M." I stared at the screen, coffee forgotten, my hands trembling slightly. She had escalated overnight. I hadn't even left my cabin, and already she was sending legal threats through every channel she could find. My gut told me this wasn't just about rules anymore. It was about control, domination, and proving a point. I quickly checked the mailbox. Sure enough, an official-looking envelope was there, stamped with the HOA's logo and a list of infractions. The first one claimed my cabin disrupted the community aesthetic. The second warned of potential environmental hazards due to unpermitted landscaping. And the third, my favorite, accused me of an authorized occupancy inconsistent with community bylaws. I laughed bitterly. An authorized occupancy? I live here. But the humor didn't last. Karen's threats were strategic. Each line of that letter was carefully worded to intimidate, and I knew she would keep escalating until I either left or broke down. I sat down at my desk and started taking notes, trying to organize the mess. Photos of the cabin, timestamps from yesterday, copies of my permits, all meticulously catalogued. As I worked, a knock sounded on the door. My heart leapt. It was Mr. Jennings again, cane tapping with urgency. He didn't waste time on small talk. "She's at it again," he said grimly. "This isn't just harassment anymore. She's trying to build a case, real or imagined, so she can drag you into court. I've seen her do this before. Once she starts legal threats, she doesn't stop until she's drained every resource of the target." I clenched my fists. I can't let her win. I just can't. He nodded. "Good. Then we need a plan. First, allies. You need neighbors who've had the same treatment. Second, documentation. Third, lawyer. Don't think of it as paranoia. Think of it as self-defense." I took a deep breath, realizing I was entering a war zone that had been brewing long before I even arrived. By mid-afternoon, my paranoia had company. Karen returned. This time, she didn't come alone. She had brought a man in a suit, clearly a lawyer or someone pretending to be one. He carried a folder that looked important, papers clutched as if it contained the fate of the world. "Good afternoon," Karen said, smiling like a cat showing its teeth. "I brought legal counsel. We're just here to clarify your obligations to the HOA." I met her gaze, refusing to be intimidated. "Clarify? You mean harass. I've done nothing wrong. You have no authority to enforce anything retroactively." The man in the suit flipped open his folder and started reading from what appeared to be a prepared script. According to Articles 12, 19, and 23 of the Pine Hollow Homeowners Association, any structure deemed inconsistent with community standards is subject to review. Failure to comply may result in legal action, fines, and removal of the structure. I resisted the urge to burst out laughing. "I own this property," I said firmly. "This cabin predates your bylaws. You cannot enforce retroactive rules. Now leave before you trespass." Karen's smile faded into a scowl. "You will regret this. You think you can ignore the rules without consequence? We have precedent. We have witnesses. And we have the full authority of the HOA. I gritted my teeth. "And I have the law on my side. You are threatening me without cause. Trespassing and harassment are actionable." Karen's eyes narrowed. I could see the calculation behind her stare. She was deciding if she could push harder or if she had met her match. She decided to push. "I'll give you 1 week," she said, voice low, almost venomous. 1 week to comply. Otherwise, the full weight of the HOA and legal enforcement will come down on you. Consider this a friendly warning. After they left, I sank into my chair. 1 week. That was her timeline, her ultimatum. Panic clawed at the edges of my mind, but I forced it down. I couldn't let fear dictate my actions. I spent the evening strategizing, making lists, and drafting an email to a local property lawyer. I also reached out to Mr. Jennings, who promised to connect me with other residents who had faced Karen's wrath. By the end of the night, my cabin felt less like a sanctuary and more like a fortress. The next morning, I got a knock from another neighbor, this one younger, mid-30s, holding a stack of papers. "You're not alone," she said, handing me documents that detail Karen's history of HOA conflicts. She's tried to take cabins, gardens, even a small store once. People moved or gave in because they didn't want the headaches. But we're standing up now. You're not the first target, and you won't be the last. I scanned the documents, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. Relief because I wasn't alone. Anxiety because Karen wasn't going to stop. That night, I sat on the porch with my laptop, reviewing all evidence, planning my next move. I realized the battle wasn't just legal, It was psychological. Karen wanted to make me doubt myself, to make me feel like the invader, the problem. But I refused. I would document everything, fight every claim, and protect my cabin no matter what. By the end of Section 3, it was clear the fight had just begun. Karen had escalated from verbal harassment to legal threats. Allies were rallying to her side, and I was learning that standing my ground meant preparing for a war that was as much about patience, evidence, and strategy as it was about courage. And deep down, I knew the next move would hit even harder. Karen wasn't done. Not by a long shot. The morning sun burned through the mist that clung to Pine Hollow like a warning. I had barely finished my first cup of coffee when I noticed it. A small, official-looking envelope stuck in the mailbox, stamped in red with the HOA insignia. My stomach sank. I didn't even need to open it to know what it contained. Sure enough, inside was another warning letter, more detailed than the last. This time, Karen had included photos of my cabin's exterior taken from angles I couldn't even see from my porch, along with citations of obscure HOA rules I didn't even know existed. One photo highlighted a slightly crooked stone path, another pointed to my firewood pile. The letter concluded with a dramatic threat. Failure to comply within 48 hours would result in immediate legal proceedings, fines, and potential property seizure. I set the envelope down, hands trembling. The audacity! I had been here for days, and already it felt like my entire life savings and peace of mind were under siege. Then came the knock. Not Karen this time, but a group of HOA members. 3 neighbors I hadn't even met, all clipboard-wielding and glaring as though I had personally insulted their existence. "Good morning," one said in a tone that dripped false politeness. "We're here to inspect your cabin for compliance violations." I took a deep breath. "Inspection? You're trespassing. I am not granting permission to enter my property." Karen's voice sliced through the tension before I even realized she was standing at the edge of the porch. "We don't need permission," she said, her tone sharp and authoritative. "As part of the HOA, we are allowed to ensure that all properties comply with the bylaws. You've been warned." I clenched my fists. I've been warned. Repeatedly. And I complied with every law and code. "You are harassing me. Leave now, or I will call the sheriff." Her eyes flickered with irritation, but she smiled, the kind of smile that promised a long, drawn-out war. "Call them if you like, but don't say I didn't warn you." The HOA members started snapping photos, taking notes, and even measuring my porch with a tape measure as if the slightest misalignment would give them justification to remove me. I watched silently, trying to control my rage. I couldn't let them see fear. Fear was what Karen thrived on. After an hour of this agonizing inspection, they finally retreated, leaving me sweaty, exhausted, and furious. But something had changed. For the first time, I realized that Karen's power relied entirely on intimidation and the assumption that people would give in. She hadn't faced real resistance yet. That night, I made a plan. I had spent hours poring over property records, HOA bylaws, and local ordinances. Karen thought she was untouchable, that her self-assigned authority gave her control. But I had facts on my side. Every infraction she cited could be countered with documentation proving my cabin predated the HOA rules. Every photograph of violations could be disproved with permits and timelines. I began drafting a detailed response. I included photographs of the cabin, my renovation permits, dated records of ownership, and evidence of past inspections that had cleared me. But I didn't stop there. I also included a brief history of Karen's pattern of harassment toward other residents, carefully documented from neighbors willing to share their stories. By morning, I had a packet ready. It was time to fight back, not with anger, but with evidence. Karen had tried to scare me, but evidence was stronger than intimidation. That afternoon, I delivered the packet to the HOA office. Karen wasn't there, but her assistant took one look at the stack and paled. I could almost hear the gears turning in Karen's mind. This wasn't going to be an easy battle. Over the next few days, Karen tried smaller tactics, leaving passive-aggressive notes on my porch, sending snide text messages, and making cryptic threats to monitor the property. I ignored them, focusing instead on gathering more proof and rallying the few neighbors willing to stand against her tyranny. By midweek, things escalated again. Karen had organized a neighborhood meeting at the community center, claiming it was to discuss compliance and community standards. I knew exactly what this meant: public shaming. She planned to turn the neighbors against me, paint me as a villain, and cement her control over Pine Hollow. I decided I wouldn't just defend myself. I would take the offensive. I showed up at the meeting with copies of my documents, photos, and records, as well as a few neighbors who had experienced Karen's harassment firsthand. The room was tense, filled with murmurs and suspicious glances. Karen, of course, arrived last, dramatic as ever, radiating confidence. "Good evening, everyone," she began, her voice sharp and commanding. "We're here because some residents have been ignoring the rules." She paused, letting her gaze sweep the room, landing on me with a look that could freeze blood. "We must maintain order, standards, harmony." I stood up, clearing my throat. "Actually, Karen, I think it's important everyone understands the full story. My cabin is fully legal. I have the permits, inspections, and historical records to prove it. In fact, some of the complaints you've made relate to rules that didn't exist when my cabin was built. And there's a pattern here. Other residents have faced harassment, intimidation, and threats from the HOA under your leadership." Murmurs rippled through the room. Karen's composure faltered, just slightly, but I could see the anger simmering beneath her surface. "I brought evidence," I continued, distributing copies of the documentation to everyone. "I want this community to understand what's happening before any more threats or intimidation occur." By the end of the night, something remarkable had happened. Neighbors who had once feared Karen were now quietly supporting me. Some approached me after the meeting, whispering thanks or sharing their own experiences. Karen, for the first time, was on the defensive, forced to answer questions she hadn't anticipated. Walking back to my cabin, I felt a mix of exhaustion and triumph. Karen had tried to make me feel powerless, but knowledge, preparation, and community support were powerful weapons. The war was far from over, but for the first time, I wasn't just reacting. I was fighting back and winning small victories that mattered. By the time I reached my porch, the sun was setting, painting the cabin in warm light. I sat down, exhausted but resolute, realizing something important. Karen's tactics might be relentless, but so was I. And Pine Hollow would soon learn that standing up to a tyrant was possible, even for a single stubborn cabin owner. The tension in Pine Hollow had reached a boiling point. By now, Karen wasn't content with passive-aggressive notes or inspections. She had moved into full-blown social and legal warfare. My mailbox was flooded daily with letters stamped with the HOA logo, each one more threatening than the last. Violation of bylaws, non-compliance, immediate action pending, final warning before legal proceedings. The words blurred into a constant hum of pressure that never let up. But it wasn't just the letters. By midweek, I began noticing subtle changes around the cabin. Flyers appeared in the neighborhood warning about non-compliant properties and listing my address, painting me as an outsider who didn't respect community standards. Some neighbors started whispering behind my back, clearly influenced by Karen's campaign of intimidation. Every glance felt judgmental, every murmur suspicious. It was clear. Karen had weaponized the community against me. That evening, I sat at my desk, documents spread out like a fortress. I couldn't let her win. But I needed more than paperwork. I needed a plan that would neutralize her influence and protect my cabin once and for all. I started by calling the lawyer I had contacted weeks ago. I explained the harassment, the false threats, and the neighborhood manipulation. After reviewing the evidence, the lawyer confirmed what I already suspected. Karen had no legal authority to seize my cabin, retroactively enforce bylaws, or bully me into submission. But she could drag me into court if I wasn't careful, and that was her main weapon. The solution, the lawyer advised, was strategy, not confrontation, not panic, but a methodical approach. Document everything, communicate in writing only, and build alliances. Karen thrived on chaos and emotion, and I would give her neither. The next day, Karen made her move. She arrived at the cabin with a small army of supporters and 2 more HOA officials, clipboard wielding and camera ready. I watched them through the window as they circled the cabin, photographing every detail. I didn't answer the door. I didn't engage. Instead, I silently recorded everything from inside, making sure every threat, every claim, every intrusion was documented for the record. Hours later, Karen left, but not before slipping a note under my door. This is your final warning. Compliance is mandatory. Resistance is futile. Karen M. I held the note up, staring at it. Resistance wasn't futile. Not if I played smart. I emailed the lawyer, attached the note, and wrote a detailed log of the day's events. Then I sent copies to a few trusted neighbors, asking if they would testify if necessary. That night, I realized Karen had one weakness. Her ego. She believed she could control the narrative. She thrived on being the authority. And if I could undermine that carefully, I could strip her of her power. The next day, I organized a neighborhood meeting of my own. Quiet, informal, no fanfare, just me and a few brave neighbors who had been quietly resisting Karen's reign. We shared stories, documented incidents, and built a united front. I realized that Karen's intimidation only worked when people felt isolated. Strength came from solidarity. By the time Karen arrived for her weekly HOA patrol, she walked into a community that was no longer afraid. The neighbors who had once silently observed now spoke up, challenging her claims, questioning her authority, and refusing to be bullied. For the first time, Karen looked rattled. Her sharp, confident posture faltered. She tried to regain control, but the room had shifted. The power dynamic had changed. Seeing an opening, I took the next step. I filed a formal complaint with the county, documenting all of Karen's harassment and providing proof of my property's legality. I also began sending copies of every HOA letter, photo, and threat to the lawyer, creating an unassailable trail of evidence. Karen had assumed she could intimidate, but I was turning her tools against her. The tipping point came a week later. Karen had scheduled another inspection, hoping to catch me off guard. But this time, I was ready. I met her and her entourage on the porch, calm and composed. I handed her a binder, thick with evidence of my cabin's compliance and a timeline of her harassment. I spoke clearly, deliberately. Karen, I've documented every interaction. I confirm my property is fully compliant. I've also documented your pattern of intimidation toward other residents. You are welcome to pursue legal action, but I suggest you consider whether it will reflect on you favorably. For a long moment, she said nothing. The silence was deafening. Then she tried to speak, but her words faltered, and she left without a response, muttering under her breath. For the first time, Karen had no answer, no upper hand, no weapon strong enough to challenge the evidence in my hands. The neighborhood began shifting after that. Residents who had been hesitant now openly supported me. Some sent letters to the HOA challenging Karen's authority. Some offered testimony, and a few even organized informal watch groups to ensure no further harassment occurred. Karen was still a presence, still plotting, but her ability to intimidate had weakened. That night, sitting on my porch with a warm cup of tea, I felt the first real sense of victory. The battle wasn't over. Karen was relentless, but I had learned an important lesson. Preparation, evidence, and community could stand against even the most tyrannical forces. I realized that courage wasn't the absence of fear, but the ability to act despite it. Pine Hollow would remember this conflict, and so would Karen. The war had reached a stalemate, but I had shown her that she couldn't bully me alone. Every letter, every threat, every intrusion had only strengthened my resolve. My cabin wasn't just a home. It was a symbol that standing up to injustice, even when it feels like an uphill battle, is worth it. The morning of the HOA's big meeting arrived, and the tension in Pine Hollow was palpable. Word had spread about my resistance to Karen's harassment, and the community sent a buzz with whispers and speculation. Karen, predictably, arrived early, clipboard in hand, flanked by her usual entourage of sycophants. She carried herself like a queen preparing to deliver judgment, but for the first time I could see a flicker of unease in her sharp eyes. I entered with my binder, every scrap of evidence meticulously organized: property permits, photos, timestamps, copies of letters, and even statements from neighbors who had suffered under her reign. I was calm, composed, and ready. This wasn't about fear anymore. It was about proving the truth. Karen's opening statement was predictably dramatic. Members of the HOA, Pine Hollow is a community of standards. Rules exist to protect our property values and maintain harmony. Some residents, she said, glaring at me, have decided to ignore those rules. That is unacceptable. I stood, my voice steady. With all due respect, Karen, the record shows otherwise. My cabin is fully legal. It has been here for decades, and all renovations have been properly permitted and inspected. I have documented every interaction, every threat, and every false claim made by the HOA under your direction. A murmur ran through the room. Karen's smile faltered. She opened her mouth, but no words came immediately. I continued. Furthermore, multiple neighbors have shared evidence of harassment and intimidation tactics, demonstrating a pattern of misuse of authority. The community deserves transparency and fairness, not fear-based enforcement. Karen's face hardened. She tried to interrupt, but the chairperson raised a hand. "Let her finish," the official said. I laid out the timeline, showed the photographs, and presented letters that exposed Karen's repeated attempts to threaten and intimidate me. I even included the flyers she had circulated, painting me as a non-compliant outsider. With each piece of evidence, the room grew quieter, then tense, then supportive. A few neighbors stood, voices trembling but firm. "I've received similar threats," one woman said. "Karen's tactics aren't fair. We've lived here for years, and her behavior has caused unnecessary stress and division." Another added, "We've had enough. Property owners deserve respect and due process, not harassment." Karen's entourage fidgeted, whispering frantically. She had lost control. For the first time, the courtroom of public opinion wasn't in her favor. It was against her. Finally, the chairperson spoke. "We've reviewed the evidence. It's clear that the property in question is compliant with all laws and HOA regulations as they stood prior to the current leadership. Additionally, there is sufficient documentation of harassment that the board must address." Karen's jaw tightened. Her voice shook as she attempted a rebuttal, but her words fell flat. The evidence was undeniable, and the community was no longer afraid of her. By the end of the meeting, the board ruled in my favor. Karen was officially reprimanded, and an independent review committee was established to prevent future abuses of power. My cabin was safe, legally protected, and recognized as fully compliant. As I walked out of the community center, the sun was setting, casting long shadows over Pine Hollow. Neighbors approached me with congratulations, apologies, and words of support. Some shared their own stories of Karen's tyranny, grateful that someone had finally stood up. The weight that had been pressing down on me for weeks began to lift. That evening, back at the cabin, I sat on the porch, listening to the gentle whisper of the pines. Smoke curled from the chimney, the scent of cedar filling the air. My little cabin, once under siege, now felt like a true sanctuary. The battle had been exhausting, but it had also forged connections with neighbors I might never have known otherwise. I thought about Karen. She would continue to be part of Pine Hollow, of course, but her influence had been checked. Her ego, once unchecked and fearsome, had finally encountered a wall it couldn't bulldoze through. And that was enough. The following weeks were quieter. I continued documenting interactions, not out of fear, but as a precaution. The HOA slowly adapted to the new oversight committee, and many residents, emboldened by the outcome, began to speak openly. Pine Hollow felt more like a community again, not a hierarchy ruled by intimidation. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I sat on my porch, a cup of tea in hand, reflecting on everything that had happened. My cabin had been tested, my resolve had been challenged, and my patience pushed to its limits. But I had survived, and in doing so, I had not just preserved my home, I had helped restore fairness and decency to the neighborhood. I realized that this cabin wasn't just a place to escape. It was a symbol of standing up for oneself, of resisting tyranny, and of fighting for what's right even when the odds seem overwhelming. And most importantly, it was proof that one determined person, armed with truth and evidence, could face even the most relentless adversary and prevail. Karen would always be Karen, but her reign of intimidation was over, for now. And as I watched the stars appear over Pine Hollow, the cabin stood tall, a testament to resilience, courage, and the quiet power of persistence. I leaned back in my chair, letting the night wrap around me. For the first time in weeks, I felt at peace. I had fought, I had documented, I had rallied allies, and I had won. My cabin was mine. My home was safe. And Pine Hollow, at least in this corner of the forest, was a little freer from Faye.